Hi, my name is Melanie. I'm going to be reading the second chapter of the Geography of You and Me. The day had started in darkness, too. Owen had woken before the sun was up, just as he had for the last 42 mornings, jolted out of sleep with the feel of something heavy on his chest, a weight that pressed down on him like a fist. He blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling, the faint cracks that formed a sort of map, and the fly that roved between them, like an X marking some unknowable spot. In the next room he could hear the clink of a coffee mug, and he knew his father was awake too. The last 6 weeks had turned them into bleary-eyed insomniacs, their days as shapeless as their nights, so that one simply bled into the other. It seemed fitting that they were living underground now. What better place for a couple of ghosts? His new room was less than half the size of his old one back in their sprawling, sun-drenched house in rural Pennsylvania, where he'd been awoken each morning by the sparrows just outside his window. Now he listened to a couple of pigeons squabbling against the narrow panel of glass near the ceiling, where the protective metal bars made what little light there was fall across his bed in slats. When he emerged into the hallway that separated his room from his father's and led back to the small kitchen and sitting area, Owen caught a whiff of smoke, and the intensity of it, the vividness of the memory, almost took his knees out from under him. He followed the scent to the living room, where he found his father sitting on the couch, hunched over a mug that was serving as a makeshift ashtray. "I didn't think you'd be up," he said, stabbing out the cigarette with a guilty expression. He ran a hand through his hair, which was just a shade or two darker than Owen's, then sat back and rubbed his eyes. "I didn't really sleep," Owen admitted, collapsing into the rocking chair across from him. He closed his eyes and took a long, slow breath. He couldn't help himself. They'd been his mother's cigarettes, and the scent clenched at something inside him. There had been eight left when she died. The crumpled pack recovered from the accident site and returned to them along with their wallet, keys, and a few other odds and ends. And though his father didn't usually smoke, there were now only two. Owen could chart the bad days in this way, by the tang of smoke in the mornings, the best and worst reminder of her, one of the only ones left. "You've always hated these," Owen said, picking up the nearly empty box and spinning it in his hands. His father smiled faintly. "Terrible habit. It drove me crazy," he agreed, then shook his head. "I always said it would kill her." Owen lowered his eyes but couldn't help picturing the police report, the theory that she'd been distracted while trying to light a cigarette. They'd found the car upside down in a ditch. The box was 10 yards away. "I thought I'd head out to Brooklyn today," Dad said, a forced casualness to his voice, though Owen knew what that really meant, knew exactly where he was going and why. "You'll be okay on your own?" Owen thought about asking whether he might like some company, but he already knew the answer. He'd seen the flowers resting on the kitchen counter last night, still wrapped in cellophane and already wilting. It was their anniversary. The day didn't belong to Owen. He ran a hand over the pack of cigarettes and nodded. We'll have a dinner when I get back," Dad said, then picked up the ash-filled mug and padded out into the kitchen. "Anything you want?" "Great," Owen called, and then before he could think better of it, he slid one of the last two cigarettes from the pack, twirled it once between his fingers, and tucked it into his pocket without quite knowing why. In the doorway to his bedroom he paused. They'd been here nearly a month now, but the room was still lined with boxes, most of them half-opened. The cardboard flaps spread out like wings. This sort of thing would have driven his mother crazy, and he couldn't help smiling as he imagined what her reaction would be, a mix of exasperation and amusement. She'd always kept things so tidy at home, the counters sparkling and the floors dust-free, and Owen was suddenly glad she couldn't see this place, with its dim lighting and peeling paint, the mold that caked the spaces between the bathroom tiles, and the dingy appliances in the kitchen. Whenever Owen used to complain about cleaning his room or having to do the dishes the moment they were finished with dinner, Mom would cuff him playfully on the head. "Our home is a reflection of who we are," she'd say in a sing-song voice. "Right," Owen would shoot back, "and I'm a mess." "You are not," she'd say, laughing. "You're perfect." Perfectly messy, Dad would say. She used to make them take off their shoes in the laundry room, only ever smoked on the back porch, and kept the pillows on the couches from getting too squashed. Dad said it had always been this way. From the moment they bought the house, the two of them thrilled to finally own something so permanent after so much time on the road. They'd spent the previous 2 years traveling around in a rickety van with all their worldly belongings stashed in the back. They crisscrossed the country, camping out under the stars or sleeping curled in the back seat, whittling away their meager savings as they made their way across every state but Hawaii and Alaska. They'd seen Mount Rushmore and Grand Teton, driven up the California coast and gone fishing in the Florida Keys. They'd been to New Orleans and Bar Harbor and Mackinac Island, Charleston and Boston and Napa, traveling until they ran out of land and money too. It was only then that they returned to Pennsylvania, where they'd both grown up, and where it was time to grow up for a second time and settle down for good. But in spite of all the stories he'd heard of their years on the road, Owen had never been much of anywhere. His parents seemed to have gotten it out of their system by the time he came along, and they were content to be in one place. They had a house with a porch and a yard with an apple tree. There was a swing set around the side and a neighboring field of grazing horses. They'd had a round kitchen table, just big enough for three, a door the perfect size for a wreath at Christmas time, and enough nooks and crannies for long and drawn-out games of hide-and-seek. There was nowhere else they'd ever wanted to be until now. Alone in his bedroom, Owen heard the front door fall shut, then waited a few minutes before grabbing his phone and wallet and heading out too, jogging up the stairs from the basement to the lobby, which he passed through quickly, his head bent. It wasn't that he had anything against the residents of the building, but he didn't belong here, and neither did his father. Owen was just waiting for him to realize that too. All morning he walked. This was his last day of freedom, the last day he wouldn't be bound to show up for classes in a school that wasn't his, and he found himself pacing like a restless animal along the edge of the Hudson River. He left his earbuds on, drowning out the sounds of the city, and he kept moving in spite of the heat. For lunch, he bought a hot dog from a street vendor, then cut over to Central Park, where he sat watching the tourists with his cameras and their maps and their round, shiny eyes. He followed their gaze, trying his best to see what they saw, but all he could see were more people. It wasn't until late afternoon that he made his way back to the corner of 72nd and Broadway, to the ornate stone building that was now his home. He paused just inside the lobby, reluctant to go back downstairs, where there was nothing to do but sit alone for the next few hours and wait for his dad to return. Instead, he felt for the key in his back pocket of his shorts. He'd taken the master set from his dad's dresser during the first week here, a wildly uncharacteristic move for him. Owen had always been overly cautious, not prone to breaking rules, but after only a few days here, the claustrophobic feel of the place had become too much to take, and he found a locksmith who made a copy of the key that unlocked the door to the roof, the only peaceful place, it seemed, in this entire city. As he stepped into the elevator, he was already imagining the vast, wind-blown quiet 42 stories above, his music loud in his ears and his thoughts far away. He punched the button and stood waiting for the ground to lift beneath his feet, still lost in thought, and he hadn't even bothered to look up when someone caught the doors just before they could close. But now, less than an hour later, he felt suddenly too aware of her, the presence beside him, as prickly as the heat. As they listened to the sounds on the other side of the door, he glanced down, noticing her right foot was only inches away from his left one, and he curled his toes and rocked back on his heels and looked away. He realized he was holding his breath. He wondered if she was too. Just before the door was pried open, he narrowed his eyes, expecting to be greeted by a sudden brightness. But instead, the faces peering down at them from the 11th floor, which started halfway up the length of the elevator, a thick slab of concrete that bisected the doors, were mostly lost in shadows, and the only light came from a couple of flashlights, which were being pointed directly in their faces, causing them both to blink. "Hi," Lucy said brightly, greeting them as if this was all very ordinary, as if they always met in this way. The doorman above them on his hands and knees his face pale and moonlighted in the dark, and beside him a handyman sitting back on his heels and wiping at his forehead with a bandana. "You guys okay?" George asked, passing down a water bottle which Owen grabbed from him and then handed to Lucy. She nodded as she untwisted the cap and took a long swig. "It's a little toasty," she said, giving the bottle back to Owen. "But we're fine. Is the whole building out?" The handyman snorted. "The whole city." Owen and Lucy exchanged a look. "Seriously?" she asked, her eyes widening. "That can happen?" "Apparently," George said. "It's chaos out there." "Traffic lights and everything?" Owen asked, and the older man nodded, then clapped his hands. "All business." "Okay," he said, "let's get you guys out of here." Lucy went first, and when Owen tried to help her, she waved him away, hoisting herself up over the lip of the floor, then rising to her feet and brushing off her white dress. Owen followed much less gracefully, flopping out onto the ledge like a fish run aground before hopping up. There was an emergency light at the far end of the hallway that cast a reddish glow, and it was a bit cooler up there, but not much. His palms were still sweaty and his t-shirt was still glued to his back. "So when do they think we'll have power again?" he asked, trying to keep the nervous edge out of his voice. He couldn't help thinking of his father. No electricity meant no subways. No subways meant there was no way he could get back anytime soon. And in a situation like this, his absence would not go unnoticed. "No idea," George said, stooping to help pack up the tools. The clanging metal rang out along the walls, interrupting the eerie silence. "The phone lines are all jammed and the internet's down too. No cell phone reception either," the handyman added. "It's impossible to get any kind of information." "I heard it's the whole East Coast," George said. "That's a power plant in Canada that got struck by lightning." The handyman rolled his eyes. "And I heard it was an alien invasion." "I'm just telling you what they were saying on the radio," George muttered, standing up again. He put a hand on Lucy's shoulder, then looked from her to Owen. "So you guys are okay?" They both nodded. "Good," he said. "I've got to go door to door and make sure everyone's all right. You both have flashlights?" "Yep," Lucy said, "upstairs." "Have you heard from my dad at all?" Owen asked, as casually as he could manage. "He's—" "Yeah, I know," George said. "He picked one hell of a day to beg off. I haven't heard from him, but I wouldn't be worried. Nobody's heard from anyone." "He had to go out of Brooklyn," Owen said, trying to think of some excuse, an explanation to follow this. But the handyman, who had been walking towards the stairwell, paused and turned back around. "Subways are down," he said. "It's going to be a long walk over the bridge." Owen felt another pang of anxiety, though he was no longer sure if it was for the fact that his father wasn't there, or the idea that he might already be crossing the length of Brooklyn to get home. It seemed far more likely that he was sitting on the darkened boardwalk, lost in memories and oblivious to the whims of the electrical grid. Even so, there was something odd about being separated like this, on opposite ends of the same city, a whole network of roads and rivers, bridges and trains between them, but still unable to make it across the miles. "You two be careful," George called back to them as he stepped into the stairwell behind the handyman. "I'll be around if you need anything." The heavy door slammed shut behind them, and Lucy and Owen were left alone in the quiet hallway. Their gazes both landed on the gaping black hole of the empty elevator, and Lucy gave a little shrug. "I kind of thought it would be cooler on the outside," she said, reaching back to twist her long brown hair into a loose ponytail, which quickly unraveled again. Owen nodded. "And maybe a little brighter." "Well, at least we have our freedom," she joked, and this made him smile. "Right," he said. "You know what they say about being inside of a cell?" "What?" He shrugged. "That it can drive a person mad. I think that's solitary confinement." "Oh," he said. "I guess ours wasn't solitary." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It definitely wasn't." He leaned against the wall near the open elevator. "So what now?" "I don't know," she said, glancing at her watch. "My parents are in Europe, and it's already late there. I'm sure they're out to dinner or at a party or something. They probably have no idea this is even happening." "I'm sure they do," Owen said. "If it's the whole city, this has got to be pretty big news. They let you stay home by yourself?" "They travel way too much to worry about always finding someone," she explained. "It was usually me and my brothers anyway." "And now?" "Just me," she said. "But it's not like I'm not old enough to be left alone." "How old is that?" Almost 17. So 16, he said with a grin, and she rolled her eyes. Quite the math quiz. Why, how old are you? Actually 17. So you're going to be a senior? If we have school tomorrow, he said, glancing around, with a sort of doubt. I'm sure it'll be fixed by then. How hard is it to flip a power switch? He laughed, quite the science whiz. Funny, she said, but the word was hollow. Her smile fell as she regarded him, and Owen found himself straightening under her gaze. What? You'll be okay on your own? You think I need a babysitter? He asked, but the joke landed heavily between them. He lifted his chin. It'll be fine, he said, and I'm sure my dad'll find a way to get back here soon. He's probably worried about the building. He's probably worried about you, Lucy said, and something tightened in Owen's chest, though he wasn't sure why. Just be careful, okay? He nodded. I will. If you need a flashlight, I think we might have extras. I'm fine, he said as they started walking down the hall. But thanks. It's only gonna get darker, she warned him, waving a hand around. You'll need. I'm fine, he said. Again. When he opened the door to the stairwell, the sealed-in heat came at them in a fog of stale air. From somewhere above them, they could hear muddled voices and then slamming of a door, the sound of it crashing down flight after flight until it reached them. They stepped inside where the little white emergency lights along the edges of the stairs gave off a faint glow, and for the first time, Owen could see her face clearly. The freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose and the deep brown of her eyes, so dark they almost looked black. She climbed the first step so that she was even with him, their eyes level, and they stood there for a long moment without saying anything. Above her there was the seemingly endless spiral of stairs leading up to the 24th floor. Behind them, there was a long descent to his empty apartment in the basement. Well, she said eventually, her eyes shining in the reflection of the lights. Thanks for making the time pass, elevator boy. Yeah, he said. We'll have to do it again the next time there's a massive citywide blackout. Deal, she said, then turned to begin walking, her sandals loud against the concrete steps. Owen watched her go. Her white sundress made her look like a ghost, like something out of a dream. He waited until she disappeared around the corner before he began to walk himself. Moving slowly from one step to the next. 2 flights down, he paused to listen to her footsteps above him, which were growing fainter as she climbed away, and he thought again of the dismal apartment below and the chaotic city outside, a sense of possibility in a night like this, where everything was new and unwritten, the whole world gone dark like some great and terrible magic trick. He stood very still, one hand on the railing, breathing in the warm air and listening, and then before he could think better of it, he spun around and went flying back up the stairs. He made it only 3 flights before he had to pause, breathing hard, and when he lifted his head again, she was there on the landing, peering down at him. What's wrong? She asked. Are you okay? I'm fine, he said, smiling up at her. I just changed my mind about the flashlight. That's the end of chapter 2. Thanks for watching.